Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Sir Christopher Chope, the Member of Parliament for Christchurch. Christopher first came to prominence as the leader of Wandsworth Council. He pioneered privatisation before it became accepted Conservative policy, and in the teeth of entrenched opposition, including that of the local Conservative MP for Putney. Yes, I remember that well, Chris. Chris's pioneering policies worked. Taxes were cut, and Wandsworth has been a Conservative council ever since. He spoke in favour of our time-honoured system for dissolving Parliament, which had worked well for hundreds of years, and he argued that change could lead to years of political chaos. Great foresight indeed. Christopher has also been a consistent opponent of HS2. In Parliament, he was amongst the first to campaign for an in-out referendum. As part of an alternative Queen speech in 2010, he introduced a European Communities Act 1972 Repeal Act. Christopher has been to the fore in the great parliamentary battle that has been raging to ensure that the wishes of 17.4 million people are carried out, and that we leave the European Union with or without an agreement. He has on every occasion opposed Theresa May's withdrawal agreement and any amendment to it. Thank you for that, Christopher. Christopher, we thank you for your honourable support for the cause in which all of us here today so strongly believe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Member of Parliament for Christchurch, Mr. Christopher Chope.
Well, Barry, ladies and gentlemen, I don't recognise myself in what's just been said, but it's a great pleasure to be on a platform with Suella and supporting the Bruges Group, which has done so much since that Bruges speech made by the great lady. And isn't it fantastic that we were privileged in this country to have such a Prime Minister, because she stood up for what she believed in, she stood up for what the people believed in, and she delivered. And wasn't that fantastic? I was lucky enough to be in her government for a short time. At the end of her remarks, Suella said, whatever happens, this issue is not going to go away. And so anybody who thinks out there that somehow this is just going to disappear, even if Article 50, God forbid, was to be revoked, they've got another thing coming. If Article 50 is revoked, the political geography of our country will be changed irredeemably, because people will have been betrayed in a way that they would have thought was beyond the capability of this great Mother of Parliaments. In preparing for coming here today, I thought it would be quite a useful exercise if members of the Bruges Group carried out an exercise rather like this. Which noun best sums up the actions of the Prime Minister towards implementing the referendum since her Lancaster House speech? And I've written down quite a lot, ones included in the title of this occasion. Betrayal, treachery, deceit, duplicity, dishonesty, incompetence. But actually, my favourite is chicanery, because chicanery is defined as the use of deception or subterfuge to achieve one's purpose. And I'm afraid when one looks back at what has happened over the last 2 years, since the Prime Minister spoke during her Lancaster House speech, what has happened since then leaves one with no conclusion other than that she never believed in the project from the outset. In that speech, she uttered the words, and Suella again referred to this, that it might well be that the EU would treat us to a punishment deal because they would want to set an example to anybody else who had the temerity to want to try and leave the European Union. And she envisaged that if there was such a deal, it would be unacceptable and that no deal would be better than a bad deal. And she went on to say, all the benefits that would come from no deal would include not only being able to do our own trade deals across the world, but she also said it would enable our country to set up its own alternative economic model. Now, if you think about that, think about what's happening in Swindon with Honda and so on. If we set up our own alternative economic model, then it enables us to compete across the world. What is contained in the political declaration? Not much of substance, but what is contained in that is a commitment that the United Kingdom would never be able to employ state aid in order to be able to improve its own economic position. That's not a point that's been lost on John McDonnell. I've had such a discussion with him about it. But what he illustrates is that instead of embracing all the opportunities that flow from the referendum result, the Prime Minister has now gradually been closing off those opportunities. And I think by obviously intimating to a lot of other people that she never really genuinely believed in no deal, she's been negotiating without any means of forcing the other side's hand. Because the only way in which we could force the issue was to say, under Article 50, there are two ways of leaving, either with a deal or without a deal. And if you don't give us a decent deal, then we're going to leave without a deal. But she never really pushed that point. And I think it's unforgivable, frankly, that given the authority that goes to being Prime Minister, she could so easily have prepared much better for that no-deal scenario. And if she had, it would have strengthened her bargaining hand enormously. But as we speak today, we know that there's going to be a business motion in the House shortly after, in probably about an hour's time. The order paper yesterday contained probably 40 or 50 new statutory instruments which are designed to enable us to have a smooth passage in a no-deal scenario. So even all the promises that that secondary legislation would be in place by the 29th of March, even that, sadly, hasn't been delivered. And if one's looking for a silver lining for what the Prime Minister did last week, it could only be that waiting until the 12th of April will actually enable us to leave with an even better arrangements for no deal than it would have been if we left on the 29th of March. Pretty small beer, I'm not going to go very far on that. I put down an amendment saying that I would only, suggesting that I would extend Article 50 on the specific basis that we had a different leader of our country to take us forward to the next stage of negotiations. That wasn't selected by the Speaker, but so it's only in those very specific circumstances that I would have agreed to an extension of Article 50. We are now faced with a mass of primary legislation which needs apparently to get through the House or Parliament before it can be implemented and before we can actually leave the European Union. Most of that legislation is still on the sidelines, as Suella will know better than anybody. But the solution, in my view, is to leave on the, if we can't vote down the statutory instrument later this week, we will have to accept that we will not going to have a new withdrawal deal, a new meaningful vote this week. It means that we can then leave on the 12th of April on WTO terms. And as Peter Lilly said yesterday in a brilliant speech in the House of Lords, for those who haven't read it, he set out all the things that have improved in the past few months, namely all the mini deals that have been done, so that we would not be having a car crash or planes falling out of the air or whatever. And those mini deals, a series of mini deals which have been done on a bipartite basis with the EU and other members of the EU, those mini deals ensure that a no Brexit deal, as it's called, would actually be a pretty good deal. It wouldn't be perfect, nobody's suggesting it would be perfect, but it would certainly be a heck of a sight better than any of the alternatives. And indeed, that was what the Prime Minister was always promising us. Yeah. That it would be no deal was what was the alternative. And do you remember all those pressures that Suella and I and others have come under? The Prime Minister saying, if you don't like no deal, then the only way to avoid no deal is to vote for my deal. That was her refrain. But then, yesterday, she went back on that. Because yesterday, and I'm going to quote it to you because it was horrific, in my view. She went back on it because she then said, column 25 in Hansard yesterday, I hope we can all agree that we are now at the moment of decision. Well, I'm sure we can agree on that. And in doing so, we must confront the reality of the hard choices before us. Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. That's what she said. But the House already has agreed to Article 50 being implemented. That's in the statute book. And she has said dozens of times that the default position is in UK law that if we do not support her deal or vote to have a deal, then we will leave without a deal. So what she said yesterday was a complete reversal of all those promises she made in the past. And those words raise the spectre that she is actually secretly thinking of facilitating a circumstance in which she might revoke Article 50. Or indeed bring forward further arrangements to defer the Article 50 process even longer. So, go back to the beginning, and Suella was on about this. Trust. How can we trust somebody who seems to have gone back on her word on so many occasions and in such a fundamental way? I mean, even last, we've got a copy here of the letter that she sent to Donald Tusk on the 20th of March. It says, Dear Donald, and then it goes on to say, I also intend to bring forward further domestic proposals. And on this basis, and in the light of the outcome of the European Council, I intend to put forward a motion as soon as possible under Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act and make the argument for the orderly withdrawal and strong future partnership the UK economy, its citizens and the continent's future demands. If the motion is passed, I'm confident that Parliament will proceed to ratify the deal constructively. Well, she hasn't put that deal to Parliament because she hasn't been able to bribe or cajole a sufficient number of people to support it. So she's even gone back on her word to Donald Tusk. And so, another piece of paper I've got here, what she said in her statement to the House of Commons on Tuesday the 26th of February, not that long ago, just 1 month ago. She said, an extension cannot take no deal off the table. The only way to do that is to revoke Article 50, which I shall not do, or agree a deal. Let's remember that. It now looks, from a tweet that some of the media representatives here drew to my attention earlier, that some of the members of the European Research Group are saying that we are now in that situation, that we either accept her deal or we revoke Article 50. If that is the choice that we've really got to, then we are in an even deeper and more worrying political and constitutional crisis than I thought or believed. I'm not prepared to believe that the Prime Minister would genuinely now go back on everything else and seek to revoke Article 50. The revocation of Article 50 could only be done by the introduction of government legislation. And obviously, the government is headed by our Prime Minister. But there's no obligation on her to bring forward any more legislation on this. If her deal is rejected again, then following the agreement with the European Council, we must get out on the 12th of April unless something else happens. And nothing else needs to happen unless the government is complicit in enabling Parliament to change the laws to defeat the purposes of which the British people gave to us in that referendum result. So I'm not gloomy, Mr. Chairman, because I think that we are within 3 weeks of getting out. And I think that that will be a certain outcome, and that beyond that the world will be our oyster. The European Union will realise that they're dealing with a grown-up country that's got self-confidence, and on the basis of a level playing field, we'll be able to do a good deal with them. I'm sure about that. But at the moment, they think they've got us under their boot. And that's not a good place for the British people, and certainly not a good place for the enemies of the British people to think they've got us there, because that's when we are at our most resilient and indeed defiant. So let's all be defiant together.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that first-class analysis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's an opportunity for you to put your questions to our panelists.
Good afternoon, thanks very much for your time. My name is Aubrey Alagrassi, I'm from Sky News. So Christopher, you touched upon it at the end, so thanks for your thoughts. I'd like to ask Suella about Jacob Rees-Mogg's shift, saying that the choice, there is a link for both 3 years now between Mrs May's deal or no Brexit. I wondered whether you thought that was right, and whether you were worried that more MPs would change their minds and see the deal passed with backing like his. And also, in the last hour, Sky News has published a story about the DUP being thought to favour a long Brexit delay over backing the deal. So I was wondering if you think that they're right to do so, and also how long such a delay should be for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Jacob has been one of the most effective and eloquent advocates for the Brexit cause, not just when he was as chairman of the ERG, but also preceding that. So he speaks with a lot of weight. And I attended an ERG meeting yesterday with Jacob, and he made it very clear that his support for the deal would be heavily influenced by the position of the DUP. And I think this really requires some dwelling upon. The DUP, the Conservative Party owes a lot to the DUP. We wouldn't be in government without the DUP. They've been our friends and our allies. We share many, many, many political values, actually. And it's only thanks to them that we have a Conservative in number 10 and a Conservative government. And for them, the prospect of the backstop is existential. Everything that their political philosophies and political lives have been built on relates to unionism and ensuring that Northern Ireland is not treated like a third country, is not annexed, is not left behind. And under the terms of this treaty, it's clear that Northern Ireland would be essentially left behind, subject to a raft of extra EU rules and regulations, imposing checks at the border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, requiring Great Britain to view and treat Northern Ireland like a third country. I can understand completely why that is totally unacceptable for the DUP. And all they've asked for is treaty change, for an exit to the backstop of a unilateral making of a sovereign power, or an end date. Treaty level change. And that request was made from November onwards and then reinforced after the vote. The Brady Amendment, which commanded a majority in Parliament, I mean, it just goes to show how effective all of these motions and votes are. It was quickly disposed of by the government, I have to say. The Brady Amendment made it clear where a solution lay in this backstop issue, which would have enabled the DUP to support the deal. But as I say, swiftly abandoned by the government, and in fact, unfortunately, disappointingly, voted against by the Prime Minister and much of the Cabinet 2 weeks ago when it came back again. So I don't believe the DUP have abandoned us in our hour of need, and I am not going to abandon the DUP. So that's a very critical factor. With regards to Jacob's comments, I think we slightly disagree, because I am still of the opinion that we are being given this false choice of a deal which is not Brexit, even though we're being told it's Brexit. It's remain in all but name, or an extension. The real choice is for a WTO Brexit, as Chris has put so well on the 12th of April, hopefully. So I am not buying into that choice personally.
Can you talk more about your use of the phrase cultural Marxism? Because obviously it's a far-right talking point, and it was a big cornerstone of Anders Breivik's manifesto.
Yes, I do believe we are in a fight against the cultural Marxism, as I said earlier. We have a culture evolving from the far left, which is about snuffing out freedom of speech, freedom of thought. No one can get offended anymore. We are living in a culture where we are putting everybody in cotton wool, and risk-averse mentalities are taking over. And that instinct for freedom, for risk-taking, for making a mistake, for innovation, for creativity is being killed. And it's absolutely damaging for our spirit as a British people, and that genius, that British genius, for whether it's for innovation, science, or culture and civilization, or whether it's for statecraft. You know, my parents grew up, were born in Mauritius. My mother's from Mauritius and my father is from Kenya. They were born under the British Empire. And they grew up with a view of Britain, which was one which was pioneering in statecraft, which was bold in the face of adversity, which didn't cower in the face of threat. And that is a reflection of those conservative values which have made this country great. And I'm very, very worried about this ongoing creep of cultural Marxism which has come from Jeremy Corbyn.
What we're suffering from at the moment is the consequences of a coalition government. And if you have a different voting system, you will have almost constant coalition government. And how cynical was it when we read recently that David Cameron had admitted that he only put a commitment to a referendum in the manifesto in the pretty sure knowledge that he wouldn't win an outright majority and he would then be forced by Lib Dem coalition partners to drop the commitment. That is the sort of cynicism which is bred from having coalition governments. So I think what we see happening now is a consequence of the government not having an overall majority. And arguably, you know, when the history books come to be written, we may find that when the Prime Minister went to the country when she didn't have to again, that somebody had advised her to do that in the belief that actually it would reduce power and control rather than increase it.
Dr. Timothy Brown from Cambridge. Given that Brexit fails on Friday, 29th of March, is unlikely to happen, the day when we were going to leave with a deal or without a deal, so given that that will probably not happen, what does the speakers feel about the EU suggesting to break the deadlock that we have more time up to the 22nd of May because they will not let us participate in MEP elections? Now, what chance in two months have we got to get a new deal or an amended deal, Mrs May's deal, or indeed a third deal, which is leaving under WTO rules and regulations?
Thank you, sir. Suella, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. It's difficult to make predictions because it's such a fast-moving situation and things are very unpredictable. But as far as I can foresee, if there is further stalemate until the 12th of April, and so for example, one scenario could be that we have these indicative votes tomorrow and there's no majority for anything. Or if there is a majority for something which would be adverse or at odds with government policy. It's very difficult to see the government suddenly adopting one of those policies before the 12th of April, in which case, technically and legally, we would be heading for a WTO Brexit on the 12th of April. And as I said earlier, we know that the EU is prepared for that outcome. If the deal is, if there is some kind of leadership or political will for a longer extension to avoid that no deal scenario on the 12th of April, that decision will be needed. That decision is needed before then. I think it brings with it very, very grave consequences. I think the UK participating in the European parliamentary elections will only lead to a very damaging backlash. I think we will see the Brexit Party do very well in those elections. I think the mainstream parties will do very badly. And I think that ultimately it will be an undesirable outcome for everybody. The UK establishment will have categorically failed to deliver its promise. And the EU will not be very happy to have 1,000 Nigel Farages in its parliament. So, Nigel Farage is very effective in many ways, but he himself has said he doesn't want to be there, and he knows the European Parliament doesn't want him to be there. It all depends on the EU agreeing to a long extension, and that is questionable at the moment.
John Strafford. If the country leaves the European Union on WTO managed terms on the 12th of April, the Conservative Party will have a glorious future. It will be returned at the following general election with a huge majority and be in power for a generation. But if we do not leave the European Union, the Conservative Party will be destroyed. And the question is how have we got to the point where the parliamentary party is out of touch completely with the ordinary members of the party. And whatever happens, there has got to be a radical reform of the Conservative Party so that those that represent it in Parliament are elected by and accountable to party members. And only by doing this can we ensure that that glorious future that lays out before us will ever be achieved.
Well, John's been campaigning for almost as long as I can remember to change the structure of the Conservative Party and make it a more democratic, and I think recent events have given him his strongest set of cards ever. So I could concede that, but I wouldn't accept, actually, that it's just the fault of Parliament. I think what is the fault here is the fault of the Prime Minister. Because if you look back to another event where the failure of a Conservative Prime Minister to have taken the right course would have resulted in potential disaster for us, but her courage to take the right course resulted in us winning 3 subsequent elections. Now, I'm talking about Margaret Thatcher and Falklands, because she had the courage, against a lot of advice, to do what was the right thing to do. And I still hope, against hope, that the Prime Minister will wake up in the middle of the night and say, yes, why don't I do that? And then I will save not only my country, but also my party.
Given the fact that the main feature of parliamentary government is collective responsibility in cabinet and with ministers, why do you think it was that Mrs May, knowing this, showed such supine weakness in not sacking Richard Harrington, I think adopted incidentally, in the semi-final of the FA Cup, so I'll be there. But Aberrant, Claire Perry, Richard Harrington, Greg Clark, they should all have been chucked out of the government, and Mrs May, knowing the implications, showed such weakness, she failed to do it. Is it not therefore fair to assume that when the time comes, she will fail to carry out the wishes, not only the 496 members of Parliament against 156 who said no on the 17th of March 2017, but all the other people who worked their socks off to return national sovereignty to the British people in Parliament.
It is deplorable that collective responsibility, a fundamental principle upon which our government is run, seems to have been banished to the dustbin in recent weeks. And we only govern if we have agreement amongst our ministers. And there seems this double standards, this hypocrisy, this weakness, ultimately, is fatal to the Prime Minister's authority. And I think she could have asserted her authority and redeemed her position, actually, within the party, had she taken the right course of action. So I find it very disappointing. It's also quite funny, I guess, that those of us who couldn't agree with the policy on Brexit left, and those who want to remain tend to remain.
Good point. Yes, lady there.
Thank you very much from my
No, I was going to just ask this lady here.
Oh, okay.
I'll come back to you next.
Thank you very much.
This lady just here, caught my eye first.
Yes, Delphine Griffiths. Could somebody please explain to me these statutory instruments? Is it correct that we apparently appear to have passed a statutory instrument that can overturn the No Deal default situation?
Christopher, I suspect you know a little bit about
We haven't passed the statutory instrument. The statutory instrument was laid yesterday, and we are told that there's going to be a vote on it sometime this week. In other words, before the 29th. We've also been told that if we vote down the statutory instrument, it won't make a heck of a difference because the Prime Minister has used her prerogative to sign a deal with the EU that we will leave, we're postponing Brexit until the 12th of April. That people are quite rightly agitated about the
extraordinary precedent that seems to be setting within our constitutional arrangements, coupled with the assertion that international law prevails over our own parliamentary sovereignty. But leave that on one side. I mean, in essence, later on this week, your Member of Parliament will have the chance to show whether he or she supports extending Article 50 or not. And I know, Suella and I would have said this, we will both be voting against extending Article 50, and we hope that the overwhelming majority of our Conservative colleagues will do likewise. And I think that will send a very important message to members of the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much indeed. This is for Suella. I was just wondering, are there any circumstances under which you would support May's deal? And how many of your ERG colleagues do you think might change their minds back, bearing in mind Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments on the indicative votes process tomorrow?
I'm desperate to support this deal. I really want to, I've not been in Parliament for many years. I've never rebelled. I've got the badges of honour that Chris has got. and I found myself in a very unusual situation of voting against the government's deal now on 2 occasions. So I really want to get back into the government's lobby. But I'm not going to do that unless there are legally binding and material changes to this arrangement. I cannot take anything less than that. And we were promised that the Prime Minister would go and seek those changes. And it's, really her responsibility to renegotiate and to ensure that those changes are forthcoming. I will accept all of the insidious aspects of this deal if we are given a sovereign way out. And at the moment we are not. We have to ask the EU's permission in one scenario to leave the backstop, or if we can't agree it goes to an arbitration panel, which is an opaque, unelected, unaccountable group of lawyers. And I speak as a lawyer, we don't want any more lawyers involved in the process.
Absolutely, yeah.
The rest of the ERG group, how do they feel about this? Are any of them going to change their minds, do you think?
I think it's a very personal decision. And I respect all of my colleagues who have found themselves with this Hobson's choice and are trying to weigh up the risks and the facts. And everybody will come to it in their own way, taking into account their own constituency dynamics and their own personal kind of attitudes. And I can't judge anybody. So, and in that way, I would ask that none of my colleagues judge me for the position I'm taking. So I hugely respect and admire my colleagues, even if they are finding themselves in the very unenviable position of supporting this deal against, their hearts and holding their noses, as it's said, with regret. They are doing it for their reasons, which I fully understand. As far as I can see, there are still very, very many members of Parliament. There's the DUP, there are many people in the ERG or Eurosceptics, and there's also, let's not forget, many people on the Remain, extreme Remain fanaticist side of the argument, which who are not reconciled to supporting this deal. And at the moment, given that we had a 149 margin of defeating this deal last time, it's very, very unlikely, as the Prime Minister said herself yesterday, that sufficient numbers will be gained to justify bringing back this deal.
David Cameron had the honour to resign once he lost the referendum. There was then a leadership contest. Various people stepped down and we were left between Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May. In fact, Andrea stepped down and we had Theresa May by default. Now, that is one of the reasons we're in this current absolutely terrible situation. So if say, Theresa May had the honour, like David Cameron did, to give way to Andrea Leadsom, knowing that Andrea wasn't herself a Brexiteer, and do you not think it would, what should be changed is the way in which we choose our leader? Because if we had a better way of choosing our leader, other than by default, then we might not be in this terrible situation. We might have had a true Brexiteer such as Andrea Leadsom leading us today.
Well, obviously, that's the idea, and that's what part of the Constitution gives the final choice to the membership. But it's like any other competition. If you're standing in Parliament and all the other candidates pull out at the last moment, then you're elected unopposed. It's the same, and that was effectively what happened, because Andrea pulled out at the last moment, so there was one person standing, and either you had a coronation amongst the members of the party, or you accepted that there was no need for the members of the party to exercise a vote. Whether something could be done next time, when you've got candidates, for example, asking candidates to guarantee that they will not pull out, for example. I'm going to anyway, I'm going to say, at the last leadership election, there was one particular candidate, and I said, look, I don't want you to be humiliated. I don't think you've got a chance of winning. But if you are a Brexiteer, I will support you, but only if you guarantee to me that if you are, or if and when you are knocked out, you will support another Brexiteer candidate. Okay? Anyway, you may think I was fooled to engage on that basis. Well, anyway, I voted for the person was knocked out, and then supported Theresa May. So even if people keep undertakings like that, you can't necessarily buy in. You shouldn't necessarily buy into it. We could discuss for ages what went wrong last time, but I think what's important now is that the Conservative Party increases its membership, so that the members collectively are as representative as possible of the wider population. Because what under David Cameron, what was happening was that he really wanted to have a smaller membership, wanted to rely on a few big donors, and that it meant that he was beholden to the big donors, and a lot of the others were left out of it. So I think we need to get back to having a mass party, and I don't salute Jeremy Corbyn for much, but I do salute him for having increased enormously the membership of his own party.
Who will listen to a legal argument that you can use right now? Because I've been told by a very senior member of the House, legal arguments have no political traction. Well, right now, I think there is at least one that does.
Thank you, sir.
I'm not familiar with the point that you're making. I think what you're saying is that actually entering into the withdrawal agreement or the treaty would be unlawful. Is that right?
Well, there are quite a number of aspects of European Union law that have been breached. Sorry. There are quite a number of aspects of European Union law that have been breached. At the highest level, it's Article 50. Under Article 50, every member state has agreed that every other member state can leave the European Union. And one aspect of the illegality is summed up by a quote from Michel Barnier, who was quoted in Le Point International, in a French newspaper some while back. And he effectively said that he would have considered that he's done his job properly if he makes a deal so hard that the British don't want to leave. That breaches so many principles, fundamental principles of European Union law, it's just unbelievable. You've got the principle of proportionality, you've got the rights to good administration, and there are loads of sub-principles below them. These are all made by the European Court. These are not written into the treaties. And in fact, until 2015, there wasn't a single textbook in the whole of Europe, legal textbook in the whole of Europe, that covered them. And the Commission published a document in 2015 setting out a summary of all of these. I mean, I'd be happy to tell people later, but my question is, it's a sincere question, whose ears have to be open to this? Because we've got from now till the 12th of April. I could be completely wrong, but if I'm right, this is the equivalent of having no political traction when Al Capone went to jail for not filing his tax returns.
I'd like to ask you a question about John Bercow, who hasn't been mentioned by anybody so far. How do you envisage his future behaviour and role in the context of Britain leaving the EU?
Well, I went on record saying that we owe John Bercow a debt of gratitude for having allowed the amendment to the Queen's speech, which arguably opened the floodgates for the referendum campaign, because he was advised that an amendment to the Queen's speech, a backbench amendment put forward, I think it was in 2013, that backbench amendment shouldn't be accepted because it was against precedent, and that he should be selecting only amendments from either the official opposition or other political parties. And he thought that this was an amendment that ultimately got 81 votes, as I recall it. And if that hadn't been selected, we would never be able to have the vote on it. So that's a positive for John Bercow, and I deployed that argument when he was being attacked in the House for being anti-Brexit. But my view is that you don't attack the referee in this situation. The problem in Parliament is that there is no overall majority, and there's a lack of leadership from the Prime Minister. That's not John Bercow's problem. And so I think it's a mistake to start attacking him or criticising him. His rationale seems to be, looking at all these things, he wants to try and extend opportunities to members of Parliament to express views either individually or collectively. And I've got a lot to be thankful for that he has on many occasions accepted amendments, indeed allowed divisions on issues where I found myself almost alone. And so I think that the way in which he deals with Parliament and takes an interest in it is actually positive rather than negative, although I realise that there are some people who find other aspects of his behaviour to be absolutely maddening.
Well put indeed. Yes, the lady. Why don't you begin?
Caroline Stratton. We all understand and are told that Theresa May is very determined, or you might say stubborn. And 106 times she has said no deal is better than a bad deal, but she doesn't seem to believe that now. So when are the men's in grey suits going to Downing Street?
Well, this has been tried once, and obviously a different method has to be employed in the future.
I think it's now the ladies in blue skirts.
Well, you're right that there is a real issue with the Prime Minister still staying in post, and there is a very widespread feeling in the party, amongst my members, at our AGM. A lot of frustration last week was expressed, and amongst MPs, that there has been a breaking of trust here. And trust it's no secret that trust is at an all-time low in the party. We had the confidence motion in the Prime Minister in December, and that was an opportunity for MPs to demonstrate their lack of confidence. They chose to keep her in place. I'm someone that respects votes and outcomes of elections, so I find it's difficult to keep rehashing that argument. There are, we saw this weekend the reports by the cabinet. The cabinet was attempting to revolt. That is technically another way that the Prime Minister could be moved if her cabinet by majority issued an ultimatum to her or said that, indicating that they were no longer supportive. And the last way is for the 1922 committee, the chairman of which is Graham Brady, to take a view after canvassing and taking a sample of, or getting a sense of how the parliamentary party is feeling, with his executive to approach the Prime Minister and advise her confidentially. Those are the three ways, really, and it's so the coup, I guess, or the cabinet revolt has been attempted, and that seems to have failed, and so it really is up to Sir Graham Brady and within his discretion as chairman.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, if the withdrawal agreement is voted down again this week or not brought forward for a vote, then we will be leaving on the 12th of April, subject to any representations that are made by the British government. If the Prime Minister sits on her hands and allows the no-deal Brexit to happen, then that will be fine. If she doesn't, and then tries to engage the European Union in circumstances which would result in us having the European parliamentary elections, she has spoken so vehemently against the European Parliament elections that I think she would only be able to support putting us in that position if at the same time she announced that she was resigning.
Yes, gentleman on the back. And just keep it short.
In the event we need to votes that the one that will pass Parliament is the FTEA option, and with the help of the Labour votes, what about having a quid pro quo where you would say, okay, I will support it so long as there's a sunset clause on the customs union, and general elections are every 4 years instead of 5, and local elections every 2 years instead of 3 or 4, to help bring our elected leaders closer to the public. Thank you.
Does that appeal to either of our
Well, the EEA option, I mean, as I understand at the moment, it's EEA plus customs union.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, that would be unacceptable to me. The EEA doesn't resolve the issue of free movement. And what we are told is that there is an article in the EEA agreement, I think it's Article 234.
112, 113.
Right, okay, where you can apply an emergency brake. That's the colloquial form for it. But essentially, there is a legal right for EEA member states to bring a temporary cessation to free movement in the event that there are social or economic factors which are destabilising the nation. That's really written with Liechtenstein in mind, which is a minuscule state, and I'm not quite sure what I think is, in the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions actually, the population of Liechtenstein. Compare that to the United Kingdom, 65 million people. The point I'm making is the threshold is very high, and in a small population, you could arguably say that 100,000 migrants coming into Liechtenstein may well have a noticeable and tangible effect on the economy and the society. 100 or 200,000 net new migrants coming into the UK, our population, it would be very hard to demonstrate that. It would be very hard for us to meet the threshold to trigger an emergency brake, as according to EEA. So it's a fallacy to say that the EEA agreement can control free movement. We would still make a big objection to EEA. And of course, the EEA plus customs union. So we are robbed of all of the economic advantages from Brexit. So for me, I would definitely have to vote against it. But I'm interested in what you're saying about the quid pro quo. As I understand it, Chris, you might go on to know more about these indicative votes. I'm hearing will be done in written form, and that we will be having we'll be writing as we do a deferred provision on paper our preferences, and so without the knowledge of which option is getting ruled out incrementally. That's my understanding.
That's how they're cooking up.
Yes.
Okay, now I'm just going to have to take one more question because I know our speakers have go back to the House where there are developments occurring as we speak. Yes, sir, can I take the question from you?
Gavin Corn, Press Association. You've both spoken about a constitutional crisis.
would you take a view, as some of your colleagues have this morning, that the way out of that is by a general election? And in order to trigger that, would you be prepared to vote for a vote of no confidence in the government under the Fixed Terms Parliament Act tabled by the Labour Party?
Well, the last time the Labour Party proposed their vote of no confidence was what, a couple of months ago? I can't remember, 2 or 3 months ago, and it didn't get support then, and I doubt very much whether it will get support this time. I have referred in the past to an issue of confidence in the Prime Minister, which is a different proposition from a motion of no confidence in the government. And so that might be another way in which the leader of the opposition could try and entice some members of the Conservative Party to come across and express a parliamentary lack of confidence in the Prime Minister without it being a lack of confidence in the government. And I think it's important to differentiate between the two. But obviously, if that was to happen, it would need the leader of the opposition to initiate it, and a motion of no confidence just in the Prime Minister would not have an impact under the Parliament, the Fixed Term Parliament Act, because that only applies to motions of no confidence in the government.
I think it's very hard for any Conservative to, well, myself anyway, I would not be voting against the Conservative government in a motion of confidence taken by Jeremy Corbyn. I am first and foremost a Conservative, a proud Conservative, and I believe very profoundly in doing all I can to ensure that we have a Conservative government and not opening the risk to anything alternative.
Today we have 2 speakers whom we've been most fortunate to have. 2 speakers that have given their time and expertise to us today, but also they've given us their judgment. And we value the judgment of these 2 speakers to a considerable extent. And we are indeed privileged to have MPs of this calibre in the House of Commons serving us. Thank you both so much.